Good evening, everybody. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you all for being here. I said to our three scholars that I would love to, what I usually try to do in hosting a health and science show, when I have guests, I say to them, explain it to me as if I were an 8th grader or maybe a 5th grader. Because sometimes I think we talk about very important and intellectual concepts, but when you're a scholar, you're so deep in your work and so deeply immersed in all of these concepts that it's hard for people who are not as deeply immersed to understand that. However, when you look at me as if I'm in 8th grade or 7th grade, then all of us, and especially me, can understand what we're talking about. So I said, why don't we just talk about it in that way? And I will ask you some basic questions, and when if I don't understand something, I'll ask a follow-up question. So that's what I would like to do. And I think we should just start with you, Debra, since you're sitting right next to me. Tell us a little bit about what exactly it is you study and why that field interests you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I study the intersections between science and Jewish law in early modern Italy. The early modern period is typically considered by scholars to be from 1450 to 1750. My work focuses on the 18th century, so really the first half of the 18th century, 1700 to 1750, and I look at one rabbi in particular, one prominent Italian rabbi who was also trained as a physician at the University of Padua. And I examine how he uses these scientific concepts and methodologies that he learned in his university studies for his study and interpretation of Jewish law. So how he took the body of knowledge that he gained from the university, from his scientific studies, and applied it to his interpretations and his presentation of rabbinic law, the rabbinic discourse.
Could you give me one example that speaks to that?
Yeah, sure. So the organization of the work itself, he is most known for authoring the first alphabetically organized encyclopedia of Jewish law, and the change for a rabbinic work from a systematically organized work, a work organized by topic, as all the main works of Jewish law are, to a work organized by the order of the alphabet, was influenced by his reading of scientific dictionaries and encyclopedias and the turn in that period to present knowledge in alphabetical frameworks as opposed to topical frameworks.
And is there sort of the other way around, how his religion and his religious scholarship influenced his work in science and medicine?
So for him in particular, it's a little bit difficult to get at how religion influenced his scientific endeavors, because the main written product that we have of his that I can analyze as a scholar is his religious writing. So there isn't much of his scientific work that I can really understand how he viewed his scientific contributions, but there are nuggets that you can get from his religious writing. There are limited circumstances when he suggests that the rabbis should change long-standing tradition, long-standing areas of rabbinic law on the basis of contemporary science. And he takes, at times, really radical positions, trying to integrate the contemporary scientific discoveries of the period and sort of update the rabbinic corpus on that basis.
And how did that go over?
So that's a very interesting question, because one would think that it didn't go over very well. But one of the curious things about his work was, even though it was, to my mind, really radical and revolutionary in his period, it wasn't really that well known. So therefore, it didn't really cause much of a stir. So it's sort of a tip if you can kind of stay under the fray if no one really knows what you're doing. But there was some dialogue about the work, and there were other rabbis of the period who engaged with it. But it wasn't really sort of singled out as a work that was seen to be in opposition to the Jewish tradition. And also, for the most part, he really believed that the scientific and Jewish religious rabbinic systems were complementary. He really didn't see himself as doing anything different from what rabbis had always done. So these sort of, more perhaps radical elements of what he's doing not only are not well known, they're a little bit difficult to uncover, but he also comes up with creative interpretations that make them more acceptable to others in the rabbinic establishment.
And one thing before we move on to David, what drew you to this person, or how did you get interested?
I had read about him in various studies, actually. David Ruderman, who is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's known for really pioneering the study of science and Jewish thought and Jewish tradition in the early modern period. I had read he had written just a short article on this individual, and it really sparked my interest, and I wanted to delve into it more, and I did so.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
So let's turn to you, David. Same question. What's your area of interest? What do you study?
So I study the Middle Ages, Jewish history in medieval Europe. And the work that I've done recently has focused on the 12th and 13th centuries, which are sometimes called the High Middle Ages. It's sort of the period in medieval history when there's a real renaissance of intellectual development and culture, and a lot of that in the medieval Christian world has centered actually around the natural world. There's a phrase that some historians use, which is the discovery of nature, that in the 12th century, Christian theologians and intellectuals and priests and preachers became really interested in a new way in studying the natural world, especially for its religious meaning. And they saw religion and theology and science to be all part of a single sort of package. And the question that I got interested in was, how did that impact upon Jewish culture, if at all? Especially in the Ashkenazi world, so that's northern France and Germany in particular. It was sort of assumed for a long time that Jews were really resistant to science, they really weren't interested in science, they were preoccupied by religion exclusively, and they sort of ignored their natural surroundings, and they certainly didn't think there was anything religiously meaningful about studying the natural world. And what I tried to do in my book that came out recently, and what I'm continuing to do in other kinds of ways in my work now, is to try to show that Christian developments, especially in the way that the natural world was thought about, really impacted upon Judaism in really profound ways, and that in Northern Europe, Ashkenazi Jews were fascinated by nature, and they really consumed the science of their surroundings and applied it to trying to make sense of their own religious tradition. Now that science didn't always look like what we today would consider to be science. Science in the Middle Ages was very different and mostly wrong by our vantage point. But Jews were really fascinated by certain elements of it and tried to really fuse it together with their religious texts and their religious tradition.
Could you give an example of what was a point of interest?
So I'll give a strange-sounding example because it's my favorite. In the Middle Ages, there was widespread belief that human beings could sometimes turn into animals. Werewolves or weird cats or weird rabbits, all sorts of transformation.
Still people believe that.
So you're right. In the Middle Ages, like today, there was a widespread belief that, and although that sounds to us like supernatural beliefs or superstitious beliefs or sort of ignorant, benighted culture, there was a real effort on the part of some scientists, especially in the Christian world, to make sense of human-animal transformation from a scientific perspective and to try to understand what this taught us about the religious world. So in the Christian world, the fact that a person could turn into an animal might tell us something about how God, Jesus, turned into a human being when he came into the world. Or it might tell us something about how when you go to church and take communion, what looks like wine and a wafer then turns into God's body. So the transformations that they're used to from their religious world could be made sense of in light of their scientific sort of observations about the world that they lived in. And what I do in one of the chapters of the book is show that actually that had a tremendous resonance for Jewish thinkers too. Jews read the Bible and found every reference to wolves and argued that those were werewolves. They read earlier works of Jewish theology and found werewolves in them. It sort of played itself out in a lot of different ways in mysticism. And I think it shows you that for them, the lines between what we would consider superstition and what we would consider science were much blurrier, but also that they took their surrounding culture and really tried as hard as they could to integrate it into their religious world and to find theological and spiritual meaning in what would seem to an outside observer to be non-religious sort of views about the natural world.
Mm-hmm. How were these sort of discussions, how did they percolate at that time from, let's say, a university? How did it filter out into other communities or into discussions that perhaps happened in a synagogue?
Yeah, it's a really great question. One of the challenges of studying the Middle Ages in general is that those questions are hard to answer because all we have at our disposal are written texts, and I guess visual texts as well. But for these kinds of questions, a lot of it is written material, and by definition in the Middle Ages, if you were writing or reading, you were in a very small minority. That's the elite. And so trying to reconstruct the ways in which oral conversations could have taken place, where Christians and Jews were in the marketplace discussing things, it involves some amount of speculation. Because unfortunately, no Jewish author that I know of left us a text where he wrote down, today I was in the market and I saw the priest and we talked about werewolves and it was so interesting. Now that being said, we do know that Jews and Christians spent a lot of time talking to each other about nature in particular in the realm of polemic. So Christians who are writing nasty things about Jews and Jews who are writing nasty things about Christians, and they're having discussions where they're trying to convince one another of the truths of their own religion and the falsehood of the other religion. A lot of those conversations had to do with nature. Christians believed that their religion was scientifically verifiable and much more rational and logical, and Jews believed the same thing about their own religion. And so sometimes in the course of arguing against somebody else, you share certain baseline assumptions about the natural world and about the way that the universe operates, and in certain cases we can actually trace how those kinds of polemical conversations ended up being internalized by Christians and by Jews and changing the way they thought about their own religious traditions.
Mm-hmm. And one last question. We so often refer to the Middle Ages as sweepingly the Dark Ages, where everything was terrible and everybody died and nobody knew anything. So why? But you say that is not so in your book, right?
Yes. No, I think I don't like that approach. I'll just share my favorite line from one of my favorite movies, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I don't know if anybody's seen this. I show it to all my classes. There's a line where King Arthur and a certain other figure are judging a woman as a witch. Maybe you know this scene? Mm-hmm. They're weighing her, and if she weighs as much as a duck, it's like sort of this great takedown of pseudo-superstition, pseudo-rationalism, and then at the end of the scene, one of the characters says, "Who are you who are so wise in the ways of science?" As though the conversation they had just had was scientific and rational. And I think that's the assumption that a lot of people have about the Middle Ages, and obviously I'm trying to show that things were a lot more complicated than that.
And interesting, too.
Interesting to me, at least, yeah.
We'll talk more. Mira, let me ask you the same question. What is your area of study? What are you interested in?
So I study the rabbis of the founding generations of Rabbinic Judaism. So these were the creators of works like the Mishnah and the Talmud. They lived from the time that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 CE till about the 7th century. We generally talk about that as the classic rabbinic period. So this is before there's any category of science that's separate from religion, and it's really before Jews are interested in studying nature as an object of study. So what the rabbis are interested in doing, their main project, is in this transformed world where all of the old ways of relating to God have been cut off. They're interested in finding ways to relate to God, and they do that by gaining expertise by studying sacred texts. They notice things about nature and they try to live in harmony with nature, but that is not their primary source of study. That's not what they're interested in devoting their scholarly time to.
So what are they interested in?
They're interested in reading texts and trying to find contemporary meaning and then being reassured that God is still with them. They're really interested in trying to figure out, what does God want from us now that God is no longer talking to us directly? So they're very conscious of living in a time after prophecy has ended, when they're reading the sources that they inherited and trying to make sense of them in a newly changed worlds after cataclysm and catastrophe. They notice things about nature too, and one of the things that they have to figure out, to reckon with, is what happens when what it says in the text doesn't seem to match the reality they live in. And that's
Like what? Give an example.
So one example would be in the Bible, it says that there's great rewards promised for the observance of certain commandments. For instance, according to the Ten Commandments, if you honor your father and your mother, you'll be rewarded with long life. Now, the rabbis, like all of us, observe that that doesn't always seem to happen. Sometimes very virtuous people die and it seems unjust and unfair. And the rabbis then have to explain, well, in what sense is this true, this holy, sacred source that we believe came from God, when it's clearly not evident in the world? In one discussion that comes up a couple times in the Talmud, actually, a rabbi says, I saw this thing. I saw a boy honoring his father. His father told him to go get him some little chicks. And there's another law in the Bible that says if you're going to take little chicks or eggs, you have to shoo away the mother bird. So this child or son did two things. He honored his father and he kept the commandment of shooing away the mother bird. And yet on the way down from that nest, he fell and died. What do we do with that? That's a great predicament. And so the question comes back to this rabbi who claimed to have seen this. That couldn't have happened. It contradicts the Bible. In the end, the rabbi says, no, it really did happen. I saw it. And then there's some back and forth about how this can be explained. They have a couple explanations. One is that the reward comes in the next world. Another explanation is that the ladder was broken, which is interesting. It's interesting because it suggests that, well, God isn't going to contravene the laws of nature.
Physics.
Yeah, physics is real. Gravity is real.
Wow.
And that's a fact on the ground we have to deal with.
Talk a bit about the title of your book and how you chose that and what do you convey in that title.
So my interest in my book really comes out of questions I had about the contemporary world. So one thing scholars in the humanities are thinking a lot about today is how human beings fit into the cosmos. We're starting to recognize that since the Enlightenment, we've separated between humanity and the rest of nature. We're living out of harmony with the world, and the environmental movement is hopefully teaching us to make some corrections. So I was interested in how early Jews thought about where humans fit in. And one thing I discovered is that for them, being a human wasn't really a big deal. Being a Jew was a big deal. Being a rabbi was even a bigger deal. So they took it for granted that humanity was folded into the harmony of nature. And they were really interested in exploring ways that Jews, and especially rabbis, could set themselves apart from the rest of nature.
Were they at all interested in sort of an order of, where is man and where is animal and where?
Absolutely. They had a very clear hierarchical sense that there were the world was a lot fuller for them than it is for us. There were all kinds of beings in between God and humanity. So there were angels, then humans, then the animals are understood sort of hierarchically, and then plants and things, and yeah. So
they wouldn't have seen themselves as other animals. We sometimes refer to ourselves as
I think in the
human
title
animals,
of the book, it's really a diss to non-Jews. They see non-Jews, and women, by the way, women too, Jewish women, as being closer to the animals, closer to the rest of nature, as opposed to men, and especially learned men, who approach a higher status, like angels.
And lastly, how did they see their role in nature, in accordance with nature, in opposition, or how does that crystallize?
Yeah, it's hard to say. Since it wasn't a big question for them, I think we have to sort of read the clues and put them together for ourselves. And I think they saw God was wanting people to live in harmony with nature, and all kinds of Jewish laws, I think, can be seen as in that spirit. Use the world, but don't overuse the world.
All right, well, let's ask all of you some basic questions that speak more broadly to the theme of science and religion, which is an interesting one. So I want to get from each of you a bit of a sense of how you see science and religion and how they communicate with one another. Are they in opposition with one another? Do they contradict each other? And how do we bridge those gaps? So why don't you start?
Sure. I'll just note, we're working sort of backwards chronologically here, going from the more modern to ancient. But
We can go the other way.
no, I'm just pointing it out. I'll speak from my period, from the early modern period, in which science and religion absolutely have a reciprocal relationship. Science is shaped by religious devotion, and religious devotion in turn shapes science. The two absolutely go hand in hand. All of the main figures in early modern science, René Descartes, Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, were all men of sincere faith. They maintained fidelity to their religious traditions to varying degrees. And the average man of science in the early modern period as well saw these realms as complementary. And that sort of interpretation is somewhat at odds with the traditional narrative of science in the early modern period, of the idea of a grand conflict between secular science and religious tradition that came about in the scientific revolution and sort of typified by the church's confrontation with Galileo. That interpretation, that approach has really overshadowed historical scholarship. And in more recent years, historians have pushed that interpretation aside and offered a more complex understanding that the church in Italy, for example, searched for and rooted out heresies related to astronomy and cosmology in particular, but they really left medicine and anatomy and other areas of scientific inquiry relatively free of scrutiny. So there was a lot of creative work happening in the period, and discoveries were being made, and men were remaining religiously devout and really meshing these two worlds in ways that scholarship didn't account for.
So science is, or the impetus is to understand God's handiwork to some extent, or to better understand.
For some.
Yeah.
For some. I wouldn't say for everyone, but for some. One of the difficult things for historians is that it's often, it's difficult to get at the religious lives of physicians in the period, or your sort of average man of science. Some of the bigger figures are a little bit easier to get at because they wrote more and we have a little bit more to probe. But if you want to understand the next level, how you're, I keep using the word average, but if you want to understand how a physician who was not a main scientific contributor of the period, how he made sense of these two worlds, it's a little bit more difficult. And that's why actually my research is useful for historians of science, because I can kind of get at that religious world and the meshing of the two in ways that historians of science who are only looking at scientific sources can't really get at that religious aspect as well.
David?
I would echo a lot of what Debra said. The idea that science and religion are in this perpetual and sort of unceasing, mutual antagonism towards one another is definitely not true for everybody in the Middle Ages. Even though I think the Middle Ages for us, for the reasons that I said a second ago, are often a stand-in for exactly that, for the idea of religion as superstitious and benighted and sort of focused exclusively on revelation and really antagonistic towards reason. We use medieval as an adjective to refer to that mindset even today. And that really does a disservice, I think, to that historical period, because during the Middle Ages, religion or religious institutions and religious figures were the ones who gave us science. They were the ones who did science. In the early medieval Islamic world, Greco-Roman science, Greco-Roman philosophy, Aristotle and commentators on Aristotle and important medical and other scientific works, were all translated and transmitted and preserved within a religious framework. It was because they were understood to have religious meaning or religious implications. In the medieval Christian world, the places where science was done, the places where the natural world was studied, was in medieval universities, which were religious institutions, in monasteries, in cathedral schools. Again, for all of those reasons having to do with God manifesting himself, or people understood God to manifest himself through the natural world, and if you studied the natural world, you could get access somehow to God. Now, that being said, there were people in the Middle Ages, as there are today, who did see religious ideas and religious epistemologies, religious ways of seeing the world as conflicting with rationalistic or scientific ones. But they were hardly the majority, and they definitely weren't there wasn't a unanimously held position. So I think there was, complexity and ambiguity even then, but we should, I think, keep in mind that the science that does survive from then was preserved in part because it was understood to have religious meaning and religious implications.
It applies in your...
Yeah, so I think I can say this, though. I think the rabbis had a sense that there was one truth, one sense of things being right in the world, and there were two routes to get there, and that they should basically agree. So you could get there by studying scripture and other sacred texts, or you could get there by observing the world, and those things should match up. The other thing I'll say is, though, it wasn't their main occupation to notice things about nature and engage in empirical observation. There are stories in which they reveal that they saw empirical observation, something like what we call science, as a language that they had in common with non-Jews. So they tell stories about dialogues with philosophers, for instance. Philosophers come with questions about scripture, and to explain it, to talk across a religious divide, the rabbis will say, well, look at this phenomenon in nature. This demonstrates the very thing that scripture is pointing to. So I think that's one way that I can get at that question.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you want to weigh in on any of you, how that conversation happens today, because it's not like we've figured this out. And I think there are many scientists who say religion has no place in science and is completely at odds with science, and if you are a real scientist, then you can't be a religious person. So let's talk about that a little bit. How are we talking about these concepts today, and is there anything interesting in that for you as people who study this a couple of 100 years removed? I don't know who wants to start.
Haha. So now we have to remember that we actually live in the world right now.
Yes.
I'll just jump in. I think for me, one reason that I love reading these ancient texts is because they're about meaning. They're about people searching after meaning. And so when students ask me, well, how do you square these texts that are so remote from our understanding of how the world works today? The easy answer is to say that, well, science is after a different kind of knowledge than these texts are. But I like to push back on that a little bit and say, well, as humans, we're interested in questions of meaning, and meaning can emerge from engaging in the world as it is, and from engaging with earlier human beings' efforts to make sense of the world that we live in.
And a lot of times we're looking at similar questions, just 300-400 years removed. But that always strikes me when I look at old texts, is that we still have the same questions.
Yeah.
So, speaking from the vantage point of the Middle Ages about modernity, I guess, the point that both religion and science have in common when viewed from a vantage point of 800 years in the past is that they both have undergone tremendous evolution or shifts over the course of time. And that was something I think that people were very aware of at the time too. So, in the period that I study, there was really intensive and very self-conscious effort to try to reconcile religion with science by, when necessary, reinterpreting key religious tenets. There are a lot of religious thinkers on the Jewish side, on the Christian side, on the Muslim side, who would say, okay, we've always understood the Bible to be saying X, but now we know scientific fact Y. We must have gotten our reading of the Bible wrong, and the Bible can't contradict reality, and so we need to reinterpret this sometimes in a subtle way and sometimes in very, very radical ways. And so there was I think, awareness of the fact that religious traditions are about processes of interpretation, and those interpretations are a process. They undergo changes over time. At the same time, I think it inculcates a certain amount of humility in us to see that what was assumed to be scientific fact, incontestable scientific fact 800 years ago, is something that very few people today would accept as being anywhere close to reality. And so there's a shift on that side as well. That doesn't solve the problem of science and religion, but I think it contextualizes it in ways that maybe make some of the challenges seem a little bit less pressing.
And I always think it's sort of eye-opening when you read older texts and you realize that the people then were just as convinced as we are now that whatever they knew at the time was the truth, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Absolutely.
makes you think a little bit.
For sure.
I'll just add that the terms science and religion are both really broad and capacious terms, and they mean different things in different places and time. So if any broad statement that we make about science and religion either being in opposition or complementary, if they're not contextualized and qualified, are going to ultimately be wrong. And I'm, I guess, the only one here who studies science that looks a lot more like science that we have today. I'm looking at how rabbis in the early modern period are trying to make sense of these new methodologies and these new discoveries that really upend prior knowledge and whole systems, ways of understanding and making sense of the world. And that's something I'm still trying to make sense of. There is a conflict, despite what I said before about the complementary nature. There is still a conflict there, and they come up with all sorts of creative ways and to reconcile seemingly opposed bodies of knowledge.
I want to encourage all of you, if you have a question, please let us know what you go ahead.
Well, two things, one comment and one question. I think science tends to address different questions than religion. And so there is some overlap, but there is also different things that science can't address and religion can. What would be Judaism's response to the discovery of life somewhere outside of the earth, especially given the Genesis story?
So I'd be happy to weigh in on this because life in other realms beyond Earth is actually something that I have a real medieval interest in. There was actually, believe it or not, long before our ideas about the cosmos were solidified, there were lots of religious thinkers who were considering whether there were other kinds of people or creatures, either in other worlds or in parts of the world that we don't have access to. So there's early rabbinic texts, early medieval, Jewish texts that talk about the possibility that there are other stars that have other, Earths circling them on which other people might have lived, and they put that possibility out there, and then sort of, think very vaguely about what that might mean. There's this whole really fascinating set of texts where Jewish authors consider whether there might be people living in realms underneath the earth. If you think of was it Jules Verne's, right, during the center of the, so there's 1,300-year-old Jewish precedents for those kinds of ideas, and they imagine a subterranean realm that's populated by human-animal hybrids or people with two heads or all kinds of sort of bizarre and fascinating creatures. And in both of those cases, the common denominator is that they're being imaginative about what else might be out there, and it doesn't scare them. They imagine that if there are other people out there who are unlike us or who live in a part of the world that we don't have access to, they're also within sort of God's creation. They are also part of God's plan, and so it would be worthwhile investigating them and looking into them, and it wouldn't upend their religious life to discover that they're not alone on Earth in the way that they might have imagined or that we might imagine. which again I think goes to show that this idea of religious thinkers as being confined by these very strict sort of, the Bible says X, Y, and Z, and that's all we're willing to think about, doesn't do credit to people who were really thinking much more creatively and much more, to use Debra's word, capaciously about what the world might look like and how much might be out there that we have still to discover. And if we discover it, then we'll think about how to make religious meaning out of it then, and it won't be threatening to us.
You mentioned in your preliminary remarks that Rabbi whom you've been focusing on argued that there were some halakha or edicts that might need to be changed in light of what he thought was proved otherwise. Can you give some examples of what kinds of things he had in mind?
Yeah, sure. So one example is prior to the early modern period, lice were considered to be, they were not considered to be fully living creatures. They were considered to be substances that emerged spontaneously out of rotting material, but they were not considered to be fully living creatures. And therefore, the rabbis of the Talmud had ruled that it was permissible to kill lice on the Sabbath. Typically, on the Sabbath, one is forbidden to kill living creatures, but since lice, according to the science of the time, were not considered to be fully living creatures, one was allowed to kill them on the Sabbath. So the figure who I study, Isaac von Pronti, raised the question, and he stated that in his time, when the scientists had completely, in his words, disproved the theory of spontaneous generation, should we then change the law? Now that we understand that lice are living creatures, should we now change the law and prohibit the killing of lice on the Sabbath? And he came up with a sort of, his answer was actually yes, we should be more stringent. He sort of viewed this as an exception because it wasn't an area where he was being more lenient with the law, but more stringent. And he had a sort of creative interpretation that he offered, saying that the rabbis of the Talmud, if they had had access to the science that we now have access to in our time, they would have changed their position as well. But he really only offers those sorts of pushbacks and challenges in limited circumstances.
Other questions?
So projecting forward out of each of your historical periods, but using a methodology, if we're having a session 100 years from now, discussing the conflict and the confrontation of religion and science, and recently scientists have discovered how to transplant a brain or a whole head, and we're approaching high holidays in 100 years about the individual responsibility for their actions and their soul and their very being. How do you perceive that kind of a conversation taking place, incorporating Jewish thought and then the new science? Since your author, for instance, spoke about future science, I'm curious, however you want to respond. Or pass.
If so, I can say
It's
something, but
funny that
someone's-
you're asking that as sort of, that's something that we haven't contemplated yet. But what's striking to me is that some of our very old rabbinic sources give us the tools for thinking through the ethical implications of that. So I'm thinking of this fascinating place where the rabbis of the Talmud are asking about this very minuscule detail of the Bible, and it's very curious until you think it through and think, oh, there's something really big at stake here. So what I'm talking about is, in the Bible, there's this practice for if you find a body in an unclaimed space, in a wilderness space, there's a very, very complicated ritual where the priests come forward and you measure from the body that was found to the closest habitable space, and if there's many places, you have to find where it's closest to, and then the priests and the elders from that place come and do a ritual of expiation. So what do the rabbis ask about this? Among other things, they ask, well, when you make that measurement to find what the closest habitation is, do you measure from the belly button or from the nose of the body? It sounds kind of like an absurdist kind of question. And then you think a minute, that's really a question about what does it mean to be human? Do we live in our heads or in our bodies, right? And I think that debate speaks to the question you're raising. Is it our brains that determine who we are as people, in which case a brain transplant would be beyond the pale? We wouldn't do that. Or are we located somewhere else in ourselves? Is it really the rest of our bodies, in which case brains can come and brains can go? That's not where the essence of the human lives.
Right.
So that's the beginning of an answer of how we might think about that.
But I think it's important to engage, so often when we on the show, we talk about an issue like the human pig embryo. And who do I call? I call a medical ethicist. And who are medical ethicists? They have their sort of beliefs and carefully constructed system of why something is ethical or not, right? But I feel like that's the place for a more engaged conversation where I feel religious scholars should weigh in as well, because it is important. I remember when this human pig embryo was first created, and I talked to a medical ethicist, and she said, at what point does this creature become more human? Like, how long do we treat it as more pig, and we can harvest its organs for us, humans? And at what point does this creature become human enough that we say, we can't just take this thing's brain and give it to somebody else, because this thing now is also perhaps one of your medieval creatures that can turn back and forth, But I feel like we often have these conversations on a, quote, neutral platform, where I feel that's where religious scholars who are interested in different periods could really have a great input and enrich that discussion so much. So what do you think?
We're all in.
I was with you until what do you think? I would agree with everything that both of you said. I think, the question of what makes a person, and how does, I'll put it in slightly different language than Mira did, but, the question of the relationship between the body and the soul is not a new question. It won't be new in 100 years. It's not new now. This is one of the key questions about what human identity is, and that's where religious scholars have lived for the last 2,000 plus years. This is their bread and butter. I sometimes think that no matter how seemingly outlandish a question one could come up with, you can find Jewish texts, and I assume texts from other religious traditions too, that have dealt with that or a similar question. And that shouldn't be dispositive. Just because a rabbi 1,500 years ago said X about belly buttons versus brains doesn't mean that we now know what to do in contemporary medical ethics. But it gives us, I think, some humility, and it gives us a sense that maybe religious traditions, or maybe somebody with an awareness of the way these debates have played out over the course of history, can give us some more perspective than we might have if we just approach it from scratch. So I totally agree with what you said.
Mm-hmm. What questions?
I've always found it disturbing or unsettling that, as you said, women are considered almost a different species. The difference between men and women, that men are definitely higher, and it seemed that the more religious a rabbi was, and the closer the culture perceived the rabbis to God, the more misogynist they were, or at least the more dismissive of women they were. And not seeing man as a gender, not just a general top term, but man as man, and women as something other. And we, in our current scientific view, we're one species. We're men and women, just different sexes of one species. But it always disturbed me, that hierarchy.
Yeah, one thing that I try to keep in mind is, first of all, I think distinguishing between men and women in ways that are very different from how we understand gender today is different than misogyny. There absolutely is misogyny in these sources, but it's not the only way that gender is addressed. So it's always an adjustment engaging these old texts because they come out of a society that has a very different idea about gender than we do. But even within that world, there was there was diversity.
Well, the Orthodox today will say that, you know, and they remain totally true when there's a division of labor between men and women, and women are separate and different.
Some. I think for all the diversity of the ancient sources, I think we can find even more diversity in among contemporary Jews. So, you know, and because the sources are so diverse, if you want to find a text to back up your view that women are less than and more like animals than humans, there's a lot to choose from. But there's also a foundation, I think, for finding sources for arguing for equality, and maybe even sources for pushing back against the idea that there's only two genders, which is a very radical idea that we're just starting to play with in contemporary culture, and that the rabbis might have played with in their own time in interesting ways as well.
I think this gentleman had a question, and then we'll go to you.
Yeah, was there an acknowledgement that there were scientific truths that were not yet known?
Yeah, I'll say.
Take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in my period, and the figures who I'm studying, they're being exposed to science, right, as I said before, right on the cusp of a major transition. The Latin philosophical tradition, the study of a few key ancient works, Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, and their commentaries, the primary study of those texts as ways of understanding health in the natural world was being slowly unseated and replaced with more empirical methods. So an individual's observations of the natural world started gaining more authority, and the search for real matters of fact that really took root in the early modern period. And with that also came the understanding that you know, we are discovering more. There is more that we don't know.
Yeah, I mean, in earlier periods, things were a lot less forward-looking. You know, for many scientists, prior to this quote-unquote scientific revolution, the assumption was that if you wanted to know science, you shouldn't be looking forward, but you should be looking backwards to ancient authorities who knew more than we ever will, or maybe knew everything that there was to know. And so the way you would study science, again, for some people, not for everyone, but for one mainstream orientation in the culture, the way you would study science is by reading their works. And experimentation just wasn't sort of a frame that you would use the way that we would today for discovering truths about nature, because you could get most of it from reading Aristotle because he knew it already. Now, that being said, even in the Middle Ages, there were people who were doing experimental work. It wasn't sort of ubiquitous or you know, monochromatic, but this is one of the ways in which, again, looking back at what was science then, from our vantage point, makes it seem very foreign and very different in terms of its fundamental assumptions.
Anything to add to that? All right, let's take one more question or two. Yeah. Oh.
In today's world, though, we find that religion does change. Whether you're looking at the Christian world with the Reformation, or you're looking at a Judaic world with an Orthodoxy, a conservative, a Reform, or Reconstructionist. So outlooks do change, and they're not necessarily in response to a scientific development, but nevertheless, our look at some of these things does change. I mean, if you look at getting back to the gender difference that this woman was, an Orthodox man today still thanks God every morning that he wasn't born a woman, and that's not going to change in that world, but it certainly does change in the broader Judaic world.
Yes, I think that is absolutely the case. It's a good observation. I'll say one of the most exciting things to me about my topic is that Isaac Lamponti, this figure who I was studying, was really trying to take the seemingly most intransigent part of Jewish culture, I sort of say sometimes the fortress of tradition, and he was trying to take that and adapt it to the changes in his time. And I think that's one of the most exciting things that you can find in the period, and that really sort of set the stage for developments that we see later with origins of different religious movements and the adaptability of religion, not just to scientific developments, but other intellectual currents that came to being in the Enlightenment and beyond.
Yeah, I might have a good closer, I don't know. But I thought it might be interesting. We've danced around that question of the sort of confrontation of science and religion, but one thing I feel like I learned tonight was almost the opposite, that they fueled each other for quite some time, and in different ways through your different areas. Is that true almost, that like the true sort of lovers of science were the most religious people, or?
I would say that's a really nice takeaway, with the added caveat that sometimes it's more complicated, right? I think if there's a second takeaway, I think the first takeaway is exactly yours, and the second takeaway is, but things were always really complicated, and for every one approach you could find, you can sometimes find another approach too, right? So sometimes people, I think probably in all of our periods, but I'll only speak for myself, sometimes people considered themselves to be the most religious because they were the most vehement in denying that there was any way of knowing about God other than reading the Bible in an unmediated way. But that wasn't everybody, and for many people, religion and science went hand in hand and actually were mutually reinforcing. So I think what those two takeaways maybe have in common is that when we talk about religion versus science, we're doing a real disservice to most of the known history of the world when that conflict was not a conflict, at least not the way we think about it today.
And I'll also add along the same lines that it wasn't that there was no conflict. Of course there were conflicts that came up. The point is that we miss a whole lot if all we're looking at is the conflict. There was a lot there, a lot that was going on, and we should look at the whole picture.
And I think for a lot of people who do science today, a lot of them feel uncomfortable talking about faith. And I find that sad. I have asked people about their faith sometimes, and they get very, I'm an astrophysicist, I can't talk about that. But the closest I got one time was a gentleman from Villanova, and he studies the microwave background, so some of the first signals that we can decipher. So he is basically deciphering these signals from the creation of our universe, right? And I asked him, how does that feel? That might push us a little bit closer to understanding, where we came from, and maybe even to know, is there, how did all of this come to be? And he was like, that's a very big question. But then he said, but look, here I am, I'm this tiny speck in this big universe, but here I am sitting on this earth, and I'm figuring this out. So if that's not evidence of some wonderful thing, however you want to look at that thing. But I do think people unfortunately feel very reluctant to speak about these things because it's almost taboo in a lot of hardcore scientific circles to talk about your faith and to speak about religion or religious traditions, and people get bristly about it. But I find that really unfortunate because I think it's a wonderful and rich discussion that can happen, and we should do more of it. Sorry, you had a question.
It's okay. I wanted to ask each of you to talk just really briefly, if you would, about what makes the Jewish perspective on nature or on science in your period or in your text distinctive from the surrounding culture's relationship to science, or what was held in common? Just because I think we've done a lot of work to overcome the distance in past to present and to overcome some preconceived notions about science and religion. But one of the things that we haven't really looked at so much yet is whether Jews were doing the same kinds of things about nature as others, whether as a religious minority or because of halakha or other factors. Just point at that a little bit.
reverse chronological order again?
All right. Sure. So in my case, I think that the individuals who I study, mainly men who were living in Italy, who are also trained as rabbis, who earned medical degrees from the University of Padua, they were doing much the same as their non-Jewish counterparts. I don't see real sort of significant distinctions. Obviously, there are particular ones of relevance to the different cultures, but if you're thinking broadly about what they're doing much the same. And I didn't mention previously, but one of the most important things to understand when looking at the early modern period is it's the first period when Jews have formal and unrestricted access to universities. And the University of Padua, which at the time was the most important institution of higher learning on the continent. It was the birthplace of the first permanent anatomical theater, the most comprehensive botanical garden on the planet, the place where many of the major scientific discoveries of the period took place, and it was also the first university that allowed Jews to attend in significant numbers. And so the Jews who studied there were studying with some of the foremost scientific figures of the period, along with both Protestant and Catholic counterparts, and I think we're doing much the same thing as their non-Jewish.
So I'm going to answer, if it's okay, with two very brief examples which I think show an interesting contrast. The first is probably the most famous scientifically conversant Jew of the Middle Ages, and that's Maimonides. Maimonides lives most of his life in Egypt in the 12th century, writes Jewish law, writes Jewish philosophy, knows lots and lots of science. He's a doctor himself. And he's very straightforward about the fact in a lot of his writings that he's not only doing exactly what people around him are doing, but they're doing it better, and Jews need to play catch up, right? If Jews want to really understand the truth of their own religious tradition, they need to read Arabic science, they need to read Aristotle, they need to know contemporary philosophical and scientific developments, because those are what Judaism at its core is all about, and a great way to gain access to the truths of Judaism are via non-Jewish writings. So that's, I think, one extreme example of a way in which not only is he doing the same thing scientifically as his contemporaries, but he knows it and he's almost proud of it, and certainly not at all hesitant about acknowledging it. On the other hand, in Northern Europe, among Ashkenazi Jews, and these are the guys who I study mostly, there's a lot of similar kinds of things going on, a lot of similar scientific developments, a lot of similar views of the natural world, but by and large, I think the Jews who are doing it are probably unaware and certainly unwilling to acknowledge that they're getting this from their surrounding culture. They think that what they're doing is Judaism with a capital J, and that they're inheriting a tradition, they're passing on and transmitting a Jewish tradition that has not changed over time and is sort of insular. And what we can see with the benefit of hindsight is that the ways that they're developing that tradition are exactly the way that their contemporaries are. But the fact that they don't realize that or won't acknowledge it, I think tells us something very different about the way in which religions develop and change. Sometimes they develop and change explicitly and with self-awareness, and sometimes they develop and change in ways that seem organic at the time, but that looking backwards you can tell are part of a much broader historical process.
So it's hard to answer for my period. I think the rabbis know about philosophy, which is pretty much science, right? And that's what other people do, not them. But then if we think very, very broadly about the impulse toward rigor and problem solving and thinking things through carefully and responding to curiosity and wonderment, I think the impulses that the rabbis bring to their scholarship of the text shares a lot in common with the impulses to study and scholarship that bring philosophers to the study of physics and metaphysics.
Let's take two more questions. All right, Houston.
I'd love to hear any examples you have about trees or animals as concepts, and is specifically around the idea of holiness in nature. Is holiness or God separate from or to be found in? And the one sentence background is my first job out of college 20 years ago was to work with the Interfaith Coalition. It was once called the National Conference on Science and Religion, started by Carl Sagan and Al Gore, and then it became the National Partnership for National Religious Partnership. And so my colleagues and I went around to Jewish organizations and we spoke about ecology and getting involved in environmental policy when appropriate. And a lot of Jews responded, "That's paganism. It's not Jewish." And so, where is the holiness? How is that happening in animals or trees? Just to focus you, but anywhere.
I'm going to defer to my colleagues on this because you both have more to say about it than I do.
Well, I want to say just two things about trees. There's on the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, we have blessings that we say upon seeing trees, upon eating fruit of trees, upon smelling aromas that come from things that, right? So we respond to trees and nature with gratitude, amazement, wonder, right? And acknowledgement. So there's sacredness there. The sacredness doesn't live in the tree, though. The sacredness comes from the creator of the tree, and that's what the formula for blessing is meant to direct us toward. So on the other hand, we have this teaching in Pirkei Avot that you might be familiar with, which if you're walking along reciting rabbinic teachings, you're engaged in study, and you stop to remark upon the beauty of the tree, that's a bad thing. That's a bad thing. So that is in tension with what I just said. And I think we can explain it by saying there's sort of a hierarchy of ways of learning about God, and at the top is through God's word, through scripture. So if you're already engaged in that, don't get distracted from engaging in Torah. But if you're not engaged in Torah at the moment, let the tree bring you to an awareness of God. Let the tree bring you to Torah.
So I really like that. On the other hand,
Is there another hand?
sadly, so I think a less synthetic way, right, of dealing with that tension, again, would be to say, some people say this and some people say why, and they don't fit together nicely. There's many views that you can find in classical rabbinic sources which say something like the following: this world all around us, everything we see and encounter until we die, is garbage. And the best thing that we can do is escape from it and get to heaven, because heaven is where the real stuff is going to happen. That's where man's ultimate destiny lies, and the body is a drag on the soul, and everything in the physical world is meaningless. You can also find views that say, and it's called panentheism, right? Not pantheism, which is like that pagan sort of view, that nature is God, but panentheism, which is an idea that everything in the natural world is infused with God. And you can find just as many, if not more, sources that will go in that direction and say that the world needs human custodians because everything that we see around us is infused with divinity. And if you lose sight of that fact, then you're not just ignoring nature, you're actually rejecting God. It's easy for me to choose which of those two traditions I like better and which one speaks more to me, the second one. But I think, again, we do a disservice to the complexity of religious traditions by saying that, modern ecology and ancient religion always fit together nicely. A lot of times they don't, and we need to pick and choose which parts of that tradition are going to be helpful for us.
Let's take one last question.
Yeah, concerning when life begins when you're pregnant, has the view of that changed over time? And I'm thinking at one point, if you had a baby that was born and died right after childbirth, the burial rituals were less than someone who was older, not considered a person. How has that changed over time, if it has?
Someone else.
Yeah.
I don't have a comment.
Well, I want to say I'm not sure that we can draw a straight line from the tradition that you don't do the whole morning rituals for an infant or the end of a pregnancy, I think that's a leniency in law that might be a response to how hard people's lives were and how common these kind of deaths might be. So when you're talking about change, about when we consider beginning of life,
So, my default assumption is that things have changed in general and always. I think when it comes to the beginning of life in particular, so there have been people who have done work on rabbinic traditions about embryos and embryology. There's a lot to say about that I don't feel like I know enough about to weigh in on. What I will say again is that when we think today about what the medieval view was, or what the ancient view was, or what religious people have to think about the beginning of life and when life begins, so one of the most interesting things that I learned in college was that if you read the actual decision of Roe v. Wade, in the footnotes, it cites Gratian's Decretum, which is the 12th century collection of canon law. And Gratian, who was a very observant Catholic by any standard, and who wrote the book, literally wrote the book on religious law in the Middle Ages, his views about when life begins were cited in support of Roe v. Wade, rather than in opposition to it. So that's just, I think, an interesting fact that shows that what we consider to be the religious view about question X maybe hasn't always been treated in the way that we would tend to assume it has been.
And I'll just, I guess, briefly add, I'm not comfortable, I don't know enough about this specific question to really pinpoint it. But in my period, it's something that the rabbinic scholars are still grappling with. Lampronti raises the question with respect to a Talmudic passage that states that a baby born in the 7th month of pregnancy is not considered to be viable, but is like a stone. And it's the opposite of our current view, which holds that a child's chance of survival increases with the number of gestational months. But during the time of the Talmud, it was actually believed that a child born in I confused it there when I said it, but born in the 7th month of pregnancy is more likely to survive than one born in the 8th month. It's the 8th month child that is considered to be not viable. So it's the opposite of what we would think, and it's something that in my time, not my current time, but the time that I study, they're grappling with, and they're trying to understand, and they're looking at the contemporary scientific sources and that address those questions concerning when life begins and when an infant is viable.
We're going to wrap up. Sorry, we had said we have to wrap up. But if there are other questions, I'm sure you will stick around for a moment, right? And answer those questions from everybody. And I want to thank all of you for being here.
Yeah, and thank you, Maiken, Debra, David, and Mira.